So this is the second part of the week's lectures, nationalism. Nationalism, we're going to be talking about nationalism in various countries, but for this lecture, we're going to be talking about nationalism in Russia. Nationalism becomes very important in the Romantic period. In the Romantic period, the definition of nationalism would be any musical expression intended to emphasize unique character and interests of a particular culture. And that would include anything from national subjects, legends, folk material, instruments, dances, melodies, rhythms. So you're going to notice that different composers do it in different ways. But just to get an idea of historically what was happening during this time period, if we go back in history in Russia, it's Peter the Great in 1703 that opens the window to the west with St. Petersburg. And because of that, people became very interested in what was happening in the West, and they weren't so interested in what was happening in Russia, per se, even when it came to their music and what have you. But then what happens is there seems to be this turnaround. 1825, you have certain writers like Pushkin, who becomes a very famous Russian writer who likes to write about Russian subjects, and musicians like Glinka, who decide to cultivate a uniquely Russian artistic tradition. And Glinka becomes a musician that we usually associate as kind of like the father of moving forward with this nationalism. So if we had to talk about Glinka a little bit, 1804 to 1857, he was classically trained in music in Italy and Germany. He was a professional civil servant in Russia, and music was a hobby of his. But then his opera came out, A Life for the Tsar, in 1834, premiered in 1836 for the imperial family, and he used a lot of folk music and liturgical chants. So that became like a nationalistic aura that went around his work, even though he had been taught in the Italian and German traditions. So he becomes sort of like the father of this movement. It's the Russian Five, and he's not part of Glinka's not part of the Russian Five, but he becomes the father to this Russian Five. It's a group of self-taught musicians who made a virtue of their technical ignorance, raised the flag for nationalism, and they stated their mission to glorify the spirit and music of Mother Russia. So here we have Balakirev, who was a professional musician. He was kind of head of the group. He was actually taught by Glinka. So therefore, of all of them, he initially was the one that had the most professional teaching when it came to being taught by, of course, Glinka. We don't hear a whole lot of Balakirev's works, even though he's part of the Russian Five. Kui, the same thing. He was an army engineer, 1835 to 1918, and a music critic. But when we get to Modest Mazursky, 1839 to 1881, he was an army officer, postal servant. We do still hear a lot of his music today, and we're going to talk about his music and his nationalistic trends. We have Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844 to 1908. He was a naval officer. And he was very, very important to the group because even though he was part of the Russian Five, we also know that he accepted a position in St. Petersburg Conservatory. Now, the conservatories had started to flourish during this time period in the Romantic period, and he was invited to become a professor of practical composition and instrumentation. And he actually writes about this in his autobiography. It said, "It was not merely that I couldn't at that time have harmonized a chorale properly, had never written a single contrapuntal exercise in my life, and had only the haziest understanding of strict fugue, but I didn't even know the names of the augmented and diminished intervals, or of the chords, other than the tonic chord and the dominant and diminished sevenths. Though I could sing anything at sight and distinguish any conceivable chord, the terms chord of a 6/4 chord were unknown to me. In my compositions, I strove after correct part writing and achieved it by instinct and by ear. My grasp of the musical forms, particularly of the rondo, was equally hazy, although I scored my own compositions colorfully enough. I had no real knowledge of string technique or of the practical possibilities of horns, trumpets, and trombones. As for conducting, I had never led an orchestra in my life." So actually, when he goes and he teaches at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, the others feel that he's sort of like sold out to the Russian Five. But the good news for them, is that he was able to do a lot of revisions of their works. When sometimes being diamonds in the rough, there were things that really would not have made it so that these pieces could be perpetuated forward, and many of these are still today performed, especially the Mazursky works and Borodin and Rimsky-Korsakov. But if Rimsky-Korsakov hadn't fixed them, maybe they would not be able to be performed today, or they would not be as people would not be interested in performing them as much. So we're going to start with Mazursky. When we talk about Mazursky, the work that comes to mind is Baris. Baris was an opera during this time period, 1868. It was an interesting opera. It had a prologue and 4 acts. You're going to see the Carnation scene. What's interesting is the plot was based on a Pushkin work, and it's a storyline, the story of Baris, who comes to be the Tsar. But he comes in a very interesting way, because initially Ivan the Terrible was the Tsar and Baris was his favorite. But when Ivan died, his feeble-minded son Fyodor takes the throne. His other son, at the age of 9, Dmitri, is supposedly murdered. When Fyodor actually dies in 1598, there's no heir. And that's when Baris kind of comes up from the populace, meaning that the people kind of like cheer him on, even though he's really not the heir to the throne. But because he was in the setting of the Tsar and what have you, is he kind of is the one that seems to come to the fore. Historically, he did reign 1598 to 1605, so this is a true story of his reign. As to whether or not he killed or murdered the Dmitri, the 9-year-old, so that he would ultimately go to the throne, is always a question, just like Salieri with Mozart, if he poisoned Mozart. So this was always a big question mark if he did. But what happens is that Baris actually comes and becomes the Tsar, and in a monastery there is this a lot of scholarship that's being done about this Dmitri, and so there becomes this pretender, meaning that he learns everything about Dmitri, and he goes out, and then there's like this message around Russia that Dmitri is still alive. Now that really gets Baris really nervous, because in the meantime, Baris, even though he's been coronated and the people seem to cheer him on, now during his reign, the people are in hunger, they're in pestilence, so they're looking for every excuse to kind of get rid of Baris. So this pretender, who kind of like is just circulating in Russia, is a worry for Baris. So much so, psychologically, it kills him. And that's the reason why he dies at the end. So it's a very interesting story. Mazursky wrote the libretto. He wrote it in Russian, which was very, very innovative at the time, especially since Italian, German, we talked about that in Mozart's time. So very nationalistic to write it in Russian. And also it was revised and reorchestrated by Rimsky-Korsakov, and it's still in the repertoire of operas today. When you are doing the questions for this, I'd really like you to go to the YouTube and visually see the Carnation scene in order to be able to answer the questions. So, in the Baris Godunov, you also notice the presence of the bells, because in Russia, the very famous bells are always ringing. When I was in the Tchaikovsky competition, I always remember the bells ringing constantly in Moscow, and it's kind of like the instrument that is kind of reminds you of Russia. Okay, the other work is The Night on Bald Mountain, 1867. This is also by Mazursky. It's based on a mountain near Kiev, and this mountain is again nationalistic because of it's a location. June 23rd, St. John's Eve, which is St. John the Baptist's day. But on the eve of it, the witches assemble to glorify Satan, and they hold their Sabbath. Chernobog is the big black goat, which of course is something that if you were a person in the legends of Russia, you would have known him as being represented that way. It is a symphonic poem, meaning it is one movement. It's orchestrated. It's for an orchestra. It basically uses thematic transformation. What's interesting about the symphonic poem, based on the storyline, of course, of the St. John's Eve, it's completed on St. John's Eve, June 23rd, by Mazursky. Very influenced musically by Liszt Totentanz and Symphonie Fantastique. So when you are answering the questions here, I would like you to actually watch the Fantasia version where Disney visualizes Mazursky's Night on Bull Mountain. Another work that I would like you to look at is Pictures in an Exhibition. 1874 was for piano. It's 10 pictures by Victor Hartmann. Victor Hartmann died at a very young age. Mazursky was very upset by it. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and creatures like Hartmann should die? So he wrote these 10. He actually went to an exhibition of all the works of Hartmann, and he got so inspired that he wrote this musical version for piano, the 10 pictures of Victor Hartmann. Now there are many versions of Pictures in an Exhibition, but Mazursky's version actually wrote it for piano initially. What happens is that the Great Gate of Kiev is an architectural structure, and if you take a look here, it was a drawing by Victor Hartmann for a competition run by the City Council of Kiev to commemorate Tsar Alexander II's escaping assassination in 1866. When you're listening to it, you actually can hear a promenade theme, a theme that actually takes you from one picture to the other, which is very prevalent as you move from one picture to the other, that are very Russian-oriented. They're legends, like Baba Yaga's hut, like the witch's hut. And at the very end, the Great Gate of Kiev is the one that I would like you to listen to. If you get a chance, the whole thing is just a wonderful work of 1874 by Mazursky, and very nationalistic. And so they are the works of Mazursky that I want you to look at. The other Russian five, Bardin, he wrote the very famous opera Prince Igor in 1887. Bardin's dates were 1833 to 1887. It's when Prince Igor defends Russia against the Polovetzians that were invading and is captured. But he is captured and he is actually entertained by these dances. The interesting thing about this is it also brings in this Orientalism that was very, very interesting and important in the nationalistic approach of music in Russia. Because Russia engaged in imperialistic expansion into Islamic territories, and Parisians always thought that Russia herself was part of the mysterious East of Oriental otherness. And this Oriental otherness is prevalent in Prince Igor. It's a part of the nationalistic flavor when you're listening to it and watching it. You may, if you would like to actually see the dances, it's good to go on YouTube and actually just Google the Polovetzian dances. Unfortunately, Bardin dies before it's finished. And because of that, Glazunov and Rimsky-Korsakov have to finish it. Very nationalistic work. Okay, and then the other is Rimsky-Korsakov. And the two that I want you to look at is Scheherazade and the Russian Easter Overture. Scheherazade in 1888, the Tale of 1001 Nights, has that Orientalism as well, the kind of exoticism, and it's the story of the Sultan that has Scheherazade tell him a story, but she doesn't finish the story at that night. She waits till the next night, and because of that, she doesn't get beheaded like some of the other people that were telling stories, and she lasts for 1001 nights. The important thing about this is that when you're listening to it, it is in movements according to the storylines. You have the Sinbad, the one about the sea, and Sinbad is the opening one. The important thing to know about this Sinbad story is that you will hear the Once Upon a Time Scheherazade, because it's like the Idée fixe that you heard in the Symphonie Fantastique, a melody to go with Scheherazade. And the Scheherazade melody is identified with the violin, and it's a very beautiful melody, and every time you hear it, you know Scheherazade is telling the story. At the very beginning, you hear the big Sultan, because it's like, tell me the story. So each of the characters have that sense of very similar to what Berlioz did in his Symphonie Fantastique. The Russian Easter Overture, on the other hand, is an example of a concert overture, which is also programmatic, but it's one movement, it's for orchestra, but it uses sonata allegro form. What's interesting about this, it's very nationalistic because the tunes come from the Opécade. The Opécade was a very, it was almost like the Liber Usualis of Gregorian chant, where you would have a whole list of all the hymns of the Russian Orthodox Church. And the two that are used are Let God Arise and Angel Mourn, because during this time of Easter, they would be the ones that you'd be talking about as he was in the tomb, and then, of course, he resurrects. It's in sonata allegro form, meaning it has an introduction, an exposition, development, and recapitulation, with the themes kind of pervading, two initial themes in the introduction, and then two themes that kind of open in the exposition, development, and recap. So I would like you to be able to listen to that too. It's a very beautiful piece. Just know that these hymns were initially sung, but because Rimsky-Korsakov actually lived near this monastery, is very familiar with them, he uses the instrumental version, but everybody would be able to identify them. The other thing is to know that Rimsky-Korsakov, besides also being at St. Petersburg as a teacher, wrote an orchestration treatise, and also his students were Glazunov, Stravinsky, and Prokofiev. So that marks the nationalistic flavor of the composers of the Russian nationalism. We're going to start with Russian nationalism. We'll be going to other countries, because each country represented that we'll talk about has its own nationalistic flavor according to the country. So if you can fill out the questionnaire on the topic of Russian nationalism, that will be the second topic that you need to do for the first week of this new remote learning. Okay, talk to you soon.
Dang it, I came in at the wrong time. Now they... Shh. He couldn't see me because I was facing.